Ovulation is not something that we can take for granted. 12 years that I was on hormonal birth control, 3 months after I stopped using it, everything just seemed deeper and richer and had more amplitude. The hormonal changes that happen in the second half of the cycle are 10 times in magnitude of those that happen in the first half. For men, you can give them one-size-fits-all guidelines. If you tell a woman you need to eat X number of calories a day, that might be true for the first half of the menstrual cycle, but it's not going to be true for the second half. PMS is really the result of 3 things, right? 1,
our health is helping other people. When you care for yourself, you are caring for your husband.
Yes.
You're caring for your children if you have children. You're caring for your future children if you haven't conceived yet. It's all connected. Which surprising activities can disrupt a woman's menstrual cycle? What happens to a woman's brain and body when she is on birth control? And how do we maximize our menstrual cycles for fertility, cognition, and relationships? Our hormones and menstrual cycles affect almost everything about a woman's life, and understanding those changes is essential not just for reproduction, bringing new life into the world, but for our everyday lives and relationships. Welcome back to the Lila Rose Show. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Sarah Hill, who is a research psychologist and the author of This Is Your Brain on Birth Control and The Period Brain. We discuss misconceptions about periods, hormones, and how our medical system doesn't factor in a woman's natural monthly rhythms. In the effort to live flourishing lives, I believe that this information is an essential primer for every woman, as well as anyone who cares about the women in their lives. Dr. Hill does not make a moral case against birth control. We do make that case on this podcast, but her work focuses on the true cost of the pill from a scientific perspective. If you want to support our mission on this podcast, I ask that you double check that you're actually subscribed to this channel on YouTube or podcasts. Also, you can get bonus episodes, behind the scene footage, and ad-free episodes over at our Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/Lila Rose Show. Also, we're just launching our first merch. Here it is, guys. This says, "See Kevin." We've got a beautiful collection over at the shop. Go check out the merch. It's available for pre-order. And so put in your order now while supplies last. Thank you so much and enjoy this episode. Dr. Sarah Hill, welcome to the podcast.
thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you made it in from Texas. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, of course. Happy to be here.
I've admired your work for a while. You've got 2 really important books that I think every woman should read.
Thank you.
On periods and then on birth control. And I feel like every woman is affected in one way or another by certainly your period, most women, almost all women. And then birth control is really something that most young women are offered from a very young age.
Yes.
So let's start with you and why you picked these topics, especially the birth control topic, because that's really controversial. I think it was way more controversial 10 years ago to criticize in any way birth control.
Right.
But you are still doing it from a science perspective, which is so important. And I still think it can be seen as controversial today.
Yeah. And, and sometimes it still is. So what really got me into that was I had spent my early career understanding women's psychology. So that's been the focus of my research. And some of the things that I was really interested in were things like partner choice and mate attraction. And so I studied sex hormones and their roles in attraction, and looked at, different factors that influence who we're attracted to and these kinds of things, all through kind of a female lens, because a lot of the research that had been done in this area had been done mostly by men about men. And I really didn't pay much attention to the birth control pill as a research topic until I went off of it. So I was on hormonal birth control for more than a decade. So I was on it. I went off of it when I had my kids, and then when I was breastfeeding my kids. But then as soon as I was done lactating, I was promptly right back on it. And so all of this happened for about 12 years that I was mostly on hormonal birth control without any long periods of time that was not, pregnant or breastfeeding, that I was not on it. And then I discontinued it. And about 3 months after I stopped using it, I realized that I just felt totally different. I felt like, and I describe it this way in the book, that I felt like I went from a 2-dimensional black and white line drawing, and then I sort of emerged into this 3-dimensional color-filled reality, and everything just seemed deeper and richer and had more amplitude than it did the whole time I was on hormonal birth control. And of course, I didn't think there was anything wrong with me when I was on hormonal birth control. I thought I was fine. And if you would have asked me, like, do you have any issues with your birth control? I would have said, no, like, I'm great. But it was only in retrospect after going off of it that I started to notice as I emerged from this sort of, emotional flat line, how much more alive I felt. I found that I was going to the gym again for the first time in a really long time. I was downloading new music for the first time in a really long time. I wanted to go out and be social for the first time in a really long time. My sex drive came back, which is something that I thought had disappeared because of, being in a long-term relationship, and that's just what happens. And I realized that none of these things were true. It was just true of me on the pill. And so this led me then to begin to dig into the research of, like, what do we know and not know about who women become when they're on hormonal birth control, and what happens to women's brains when they're using hormonal contraception. And ultimately, this led me to uncover research that in some cases was like 3 decades old, where researchers had been publishing on the impact of hormonal birth control use on different facets of women's psychological functioning and behavior. But most women are never told about it. And so then I felt like I had the responsibility to write this book. And so I could write it from the perspective of somebody who's not vilifying birth control, but who also can be very critical of what hormonal birth control does. Because the fact of the matter is, when you change women's hormones, it changes women. And we've been way too cavalier about giving women hormonal birth control for everything ranging from acne to irregular menstrual cycles and all of these things that probably have far simpler solutions than just turning off a woman's production of sex hormones, which is what you do with hormonal birth control. And I really wanted to bring to light these issues because a lot of these things are things that people don't ever think anything about.
So there's so much to unpack here. And it also goes into the book that's out now called The Period Brain, which is really understanding even women's cycles, which is foundational to understanding why the birth control pill has issues for women. And what I love about your work is it's completely science-based. So, you know where I stand morally in this show on abortifacients and about, the moral issues around sexuality and things like that. But just clearly looking at what are the impacts health-wise, psychologically, emotionally on women, I think is absolutely essential. Everyone deserves to know this information, regardless of where they stand on any other issue. People need to know. And so I know foundational to even understanding your brain on birth control, it's kind of like you have to understand what is women's brain. And like you were describing earlier, Dr. Hill, you're saying, I felt totally different after 3 months without the pill. It's like you felt like a different person in some ways.
Yes.
So should we start foundationally with what is even a woman's brain supposed to be like in its natural state without hormones, additional hormones or synthetic hormones added in?
Yeah, I love that. I think that that's perfect. And just to orient yourself, let's just talk about the menstrual cycle, right? And we always, culturally, we tend to only talk about women's periods or the menstrual cycle with respect to, you want to have a baby. And so now you need to understand the cycle, or just, you have your period, so you need period products. But other than that, there's not a really great appreciation for the fact that our hormonal cycles and our menstrual cycle, in addition to being the thing that ultimately allows us to have a baby, is also how our body produces most of our sex hormones. Right. And to just orient yourself to a menstrual cycle, we'll start with the first day of your cycle. And that's the day that you get your period. So that is day 1 of the cycle. And on that day of the cycle, hormone levels are very low. So this is actually the point in the cycle when women's hormone levels are at their lowest.
All hormones.
They're sex hormones. So they're primary sex hormones. Estrogen and progesterone are very low. And there are other sex hormone, testosterone, that's also important for women, but we produce it in far less quantities or far lower quantities than men do. That's also low. So our sex hormones are low at the beginning of the cycle. So our period starts, our sex hormones are very low. And when sex hormones are low, this actually sends a signal to the brain, because the brain is wired to pick up on and measure and be able to identify hormone levels. That tells the brain that it's time to start stimulating the ovaries, to start stimulating egg follicles to prepare for a new ovulation. So the brain will tell the ovaries, start stimulating egg follicles, right? The ovary will do what it's told and egg follicles will begin to develop. And as they develop, they begin to release women's first primary sex hormone, estrogen. And estrogen levels during the first, couple of days of the cycle are relatively low. And then as these follicles begin to mature, it increases and increases. At some point, a dominant follicle will take over. So even though women begin stimulating several egg follicles, the best one, so the one that's growing the most rapidly and robustly, takes over, and it's the chosen follicle for that cycle. The rest of the follicles retreat. The one dominant follicle begins to fully take over. And when it begins to really fully mature, that's when estrogen levels really start to rise, which is something that generally happens between like days 9 to 14 of the cycle. So again, day 1 is the day you get your period. So days 9 to 14 are, about a week and a half to the 2-week point after you started your period.
So there's a slow ramp up from moment of period, the baseline low for all the sex hormones, including testosterone, you said. And then there's a slow ramp up until
about
ultimately ovulation.
like right prior to ovulation. So like I said, about 5 days prior to ovulation is when estrogen levels really start to skyrocket. And it's this really rapid rising of estrogen that happens about 5 days prior to ovulation that actually is what causes ovulation to happen, because that causes the release of luteinizing hormone, which then ultimately causes the egg to get released. And so we can think about the first 14 days of the menstrual cycle as being this period of time where estrogen is the primary sex hormone, right? Because this is the hormone that's being released as these egg follicles are being stimulated, and then as the dominant follicle takes over. And this hormone is oriented toward optimizing women's brains and bodies for attraction and for sex, right? And so generally what we tend to see is that especially when estrogen is rising, right prior to ovulation, in what we call the fertile window, which refers to the 5 days prior to ovulation, and then the day of ovulation itself. And this is called the fertile window because this is, of course, when sex can lead to conception. During that period of time, estrogen is really climbing, and this is associated with increases in sexual desire in women. So women tend to have higher sex drive. They tend to feel sexier, so they feel better about themselves. They tend to smell sexier to men. They sound sexier to men.
Wild.
Yeah, they move in a way that men find sexier. I mean, there's just, it's like all of the cells in our body are kind of working together to get us optimized for being our maximal in attractiveness, and then also to orient us toward having sex, because this is the time when sex can lead to conception. And so we can think about estrogen as being this hormone that helps to orient ourselves in this way. And this is what we see in the first half of the menstrual cycle. After ovulation happens, that empty egg follicle actually becomes a temporary endocrine structure that's called the corpus luteum. And its job is to release women's second primary sex hormone, progesterone. And progesterone rises and falls during the last 12 to 14 days of the cycle. So generally, roughly, we'll say 2 weeks. And during this time, progesterone, instead of optimizing women's brains and bodies for attraction and sex, this hormone is directed at orienting our body to be optimized for implantation and pregnancy. And so this leads to a complete shift in what our body is doing. Our body takes all of those resources that it was investing in making us attractive and making us maximally able to tell the difference between, high and low quality mates. And instead it directs that energy toward building and differentiating the cells in our endometrium to prepare for implantation, right? It tends to shift our energy, instead of being outward focused, toward going out and doing things and being social and potentially attracting the attention of potential partners. It directs that energy inward, and women become more internal. They become more relaxed, and they tend to have more fatigue. And a lot of this is the result of some of the changes that happen in response to the release of progesterone. And all of this is the result of this really nice neurosteroid that gets released when progesterone is being broken down in the body. It's called allopregnanolone, and it has the effect of stimulating GABA receptors in women's brains. And when GABA receptors are being stimulated, this has the effect of soothing the brain, calming it down, and inhibiting neurotransmission. So essentially, it's kind of like turning down the volume on excitement in the brain. It kind of calms us down, sometimes even into a place that can feel almost like low-key depression, just because we're less outward focused and we're more inward focused. We tend to be more relaxed. We tend to be a little bit more subdued. We tend to have lower energy levels. And all of these things are guided toward keeping a woman safe, right, for the possibility of implantation. So not going out and doing a bunch of things that are potentially dangerous and can put her in harm's way. But also to help maintain energy, because women's basal metabolic rate increases during this time because of the difficult task that is putting together an endometrial lining that's ready for pregnancy, and also preparing the female body for the demands of pregnancy. And so we tend to see that women experience the shift to conserve energy and to help offset the changes in resting metabolic rate that happen in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And so essentially what we see for women is that as you shift across the cycle, that, the female brain and the rest of the female body is designed in a way that makes it very sensitive to sex hormones, right? Such that our brain and body do things that, estrogen kind of leads us down this path that's optimized for attraction and sex. Then progesterone leads us down this path that's optimized for implantation and pregnancy. And the female brain is designed to cycle between these two hormones seamlessly because our bodies require doing those two activities in order to reproduce, right? We have to both have sex and we have to be able to gestate. And so the waxing and waning of our sex hormones is a result of cycling between those two states.
As we enter into one of the most beautiful and holy times of the year, Advent, Hallow's Pray 25 Challenge, Be Still, is an invitation to set aside the endless to-do lists and to build a daily habit of quiet prayer. You'll be guided through the story of the Nativity, and for families, Hallow is offering a kids' Advent prayer challenge as well. Of course, Hallow also has thousands of other prayers, meditations, and beautiful Christmas music. So if your heart is longing for a more prayerful, Christ-centered Advent, I encourage you to join millions around the world in Hallow's Pray 25 Challenge, Be Still. You can download the Hallow app today and get 3 months free at hallow.com/Lila. Take this Advent to slow down, listen, and to rediscover the peace that comes only from Jesus. That's hallow.com/Lila for 3 months free. You know how much I love and support everylife.com, America's only pro-life diaper company, and also its fastest growing diaper company. Well, now the great team over at EveryLife has officially launched something new. They've created EveryLife Women, a clean, premium feminine care line designed to honor women the way God intended. I've tried these products and they're great. Their pads and tampons are thoughtfully designed with 100% certified organic cotton. EveryLife Women brings uncompromising integrity together with comfort and care that you can count on. No harsh ingredients, no toxins, just products that reflect dignity and the truth of who we are as women. You can try EveryLife's new feminine care brand, EveryLife Women, with my code Lila for 10% off your order. Visit everylife.com/Lila to shop now and use the code Lila at checkout. So all of that intricate process of the up and the down of the sex hormones affects so much more than your reproductive system. It affects your entire body. It affects your energy levels, your ability to even how you think, your mood, so many other things. Can you walk us through, and we're going to get into come back to birth control pills, because I think that's incredibly important, but laying this baseline is so key. And again, this is stuff that I think most women should be taught. I think all women should be taught. Most women aren't taught from young ages. And I do think our medical system treats women like men without understanding these core differences. And that's why this is so key, what you're doing. So thank you. But walk us through those different stages of our cycle and what impact that has then on our mood, our emotions, and why when you went off the birth control pill and you're going through the whole cycle now, you said everything became more alive, it became more vivid. You picked up music that you hadn't listened to in a long time. It felt like you were a new person.
Yeah, I mean, our whole body is wired to be sensitive to sex hormones. So again, we've trivialized hormones as just being, relegated to only being important when it comes to reproduction, or only being important in terms of figuring out whether or not you need to buy tampons or not. But the fact is, our entire body from head to toe is wired to be sensitive to sex hormones, meaning that the cells in our body from head to toe change what they do in response to our different hormones. And this is necessary because the entire female body has to totally reorganize itself in order to be pregnant. And just to give an example of this, like the immune system, for example, it can't just do its normal day-to-day activities when women's bodies are preparing for pregnancy, because the immune system is designed to attack things that are genetically non-self, right? And especially things that are genetically non-self that are then siphoning resources out of the body, right? And this obviously has an awful lot in common with an embryo. And because of this, the female body, when progesterone is being released, again, this hormone that's orienting our body toward being optimized for implantation and pregnancy, it taps the brakes on the immune system, right? So it shifts our immune system. It shifts our cardiovascular system because our body has to work harder when it's preparing for the possibility of pregnancy, because if an embryo implants, it's going to have to be the blood supply both for itself and for the embryo. And what we see is that respiration rate and heart rate increase in the second half of the cycle. So our cardiovascular system and our respiratory system are sensitive to sex hormones. We also see that mood is sensitive to sex hormones. And so we know, for example, that when women are in the phase of the cycle that's dominated by progesterone, so during the luteal phase, that last 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, that women's brains become more easily primed for fear. We become more vigilant. And what this means is that our brain actually lowers the threshold on what it considers to be a threat before it starts sounding the alarm bells. So normally when we're not in the luteal phase, we might, get some input that's potentially diagnostic of there being a social threat. But our brain says, oh, don't worry about it. It's probably fine. In the luteal phase, the exact same stimulus can cause the alarm bells to sound because our brain is designed for vigilance during this period when our body is preparing for pregnancy, and the possibility that it's not just being scared for itself, it's being scared for its, this protecting this embryo and this fetus and this child. And we know that this happens, and this is one of the reasons that when women are in the last two weeks of the menstrual cycle, that many women experience changes in mood, and some of them can experience things like anxiety because of the changing threshold that our brain has for detecting threats. And it does this on purpose because pregnancy is a time when women are incredibly vulnerable. It's and when we consider the historical context in which these tendencies were inherited by our ancestors, women were even more dependent on their male partners in particular for provisioning and protection than we are even currently. And so it makes sense that women's brains are going to be really vigilant toward potential threats because they really need to make sure that they're maintaining the integrity of their relationship, because they're going to be so dependent, or they're in a greater state of dependency to their partner for provisioning and protection, particularly when they're preparing for pregnancy. And so all of this is simply to say that, pretty much everything in our body is sensitive to our shifting sex hormones. And this is true when it comes to our emotional states. It's true when it comes to sexual desire. We know that sexual desire peaks when estrogen is high in the cycle, when conception is possible. Sexual desire then falls in the second half of the cycle when progesterone is the primary sex hormone, and sex can no longer lead to conception. We know that it changes the way that women's bodies can respond to medication that helps to support their health across the cycle. So just to give an example of this, we know that women who have asthma tend to have their symptoms controlled less well in the second half of the cycle compared to the first half of the cycle because of changes that you get in what's called respiratory drive in the second half of the cycle, because again, your body is preparing for the possibility of pregnancy, which means that it needs more oxygen and more energy to, again, you're building this endometrial layer. And this means that as your respiratory drive increases and your need for breath increases, that this is going to shift women's experiences of asthma symptoms. And many women find that their symptoms aren't as well controlled in the second half of the cycle compared to the first half of the cycle. And the list goes on. There's so many ways that our sex hormones affect our brains and our bodies. And so much of it has been completely underappreciated by science and by medicine, which has just given women, either one size fits all sets of recommendations for what their bodies need that don't fit a cyclical female, since women's bodies needs change across the cycle, or the recommendations that are based on men, right? And again, this is where we're
have
taking
just mostly just it's a consistent sex hormone level that men have. I mean, obviously when they work out more, they're going to experience higher testosterone, things like that, but they're not going through a cycle like women are on a monthly basis, obviously.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. And the reason that men only need to have one sex hormone is that their bodies only need to do one thing to reproduce. And so they don't need to cycle. The whole reason that we cycle in the first place is because our bodies have to do two different and very distinct sets of activities in order to reproduce. And so, for men, you can give them one size fits all guidelines for like nutrition, for example, and tell men you need X number of calories a day. And that will generally apply to men, plus or minus how much exercise they did. But for a woman, for example, where you do get changes in even resting metabolic rate that happen across the cycle, if you tell a woman you need to eat X number of calories a day, that might be true for the first half of the menstrual cycle, but it's not going to be true for the second half of the menstrual cycle, or vice versa, because we know that in the luteal phase, that women's resting metabolic rate increases by 7 to 11%, which means an additional 150 to 200 calories a day.
That's great.
You need, and that half of the cycle.
This is leading up to your period.
Well, yeah. This is in the week or 2 weeks leading up to your period, you need more calories. So it's really the 2 weeks leading up to your period where your calorie needs increase. And women aren't told about this. And instead, women are told, these one size fits all guidelines for what they're supposed to eat. And then women are going through the second half of their menstrual cycle and feeling like they're having food cravings and that they're hungry all the time and they're so tired and they're so cranky. And it's because we haven't been giving our bodies what they need, because all that we've been told is, oh, you need X number of calories a day. We aren't told that our energy needs change in response to our hormones. And we're not told about anything that changes in response to our hormones, except in the context of pregnancy and then getting our periods. But it's so much more than that. Like our sex hormones, as they cycle, it does change our body and it changes our brain in ways that are very functional and are very much they're just an essential part of being female. The female experience is one that's characterized by these cycling hormones. And so, not understanding that can really create problems and lead women to feel disordered, especially in the second half of the menstrual cycle, since much of the guidance that women have been given for how to take care of their bodies and what their bodies and their brains need has either been based on men or based on women in the first half of the cycle, when women's bodies are most similar to that of a man. And that means that many of the recommendations and much of the guidance that we've been given doesn't always fit for the second half of the cycle, leading so many women to experience feelings of disorder during this time.
Well, and you have some very intense discomfort that many women experience with PMS. Mm-hmm. And I want to get into that more too, because I think and you did a great job of going through these different parts of the cycle and then optimizing health, because if we are not optimizing our health, then we're going to experience worsening symptoms. Like you said, energy is lower in luteal phase as an example, because you're preparing potentially for pregnancy, or you're going to have your period. And during that time, you're going to, you need to appreciate that, understand that, take care of yourself, but you can also experience it worse than it needs to be. And I think that's where like heavy bloating, cramps, extreme mood swings, a lot of women, I think that's normal. And they're even prescribed birth control pills sometimes to sort of heal that.
Right. Yeah. And I think that when we talk about PMS, PMS is really the result of three things, right? One are these functional changes that happen on purpose. So for example, talking about the fact that our threat detector, shifts and becomes more vigilant in the second half of the cycle. That's something that's supposed to happen because it served a protective function, through our history as a species, right? And same too with you get a decrease in sexual desire that happens in the second half of the cycle. That's supposed to happen because sex is biologically costly, right? It's physically costly to do, but it also can increase inflammatory activity near the cervix, which isn't necessarily an optimal state for pregnancy, to like for implantation to occur. We experience changes in our like outward facing motivation. And again, that makes sense. And it's very adaptive and it helps us to conserve energy when our body is engaged in this very costly building project that is creating the endometrial lining. And so our body experiences some of these shifts are things that are supposed to happen on purpose, right? And these things are things you can feel, right? But it should feel like coasting down a street and down a hill. It shouldn't feel like careening off the side of a cliff, right? And that's generally what women experience when they're experiencing like what we consider PMS.
Yeah.
Right? So,
I mean, I know so many women who they're in bed for days.
Yes.
There was a time before I was more, I think, aware of nutrition and the need for better nutrition and sleep where it was brutal for me. I remember being in my early 20s and just like wanting to be in bed for 2 days. And everyone just thought that was normal unless you're on the birth control pill. That's just the price you have to pay.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. And so like one part is like things that are happening on purpose that are supposed to happen. The other part is our body reacting to the fact that we're not giving it what it actually needs during this time. So the example of the calories again, our body, our resting metabolic rate does increase. And if you're following the traditional nutritional guidelines that we've all been given and you're not eating enough, you're going to get food cravings and you might have a binge eating episode because your body is going to say, what are you doing? Like, I'm thinking that I'm going to be preparing for a pregnancy here and you're not going to feed me what I need. And that can lead our body to totally rebel, which can lead us to totally go off the rails. So some of the symptoms that we experience are also the result of the fact that we're just given a bad set of recommendations for what our bodies need because nobody really appreciates the scope of the changes that happen in women's bodies as they cycle across their hormones. And part of the period brain is just really letting women have a user guide to what their bodies need as they shift in the different phases of the menstrual cycle. And then the last thing is really consistent with your experiences, and that is that when we don't take care of the physical health of our bodies, it erodes our resilience to hormonal changes. And when we are not resilient to hormonal changes, meaning that the cells in our body are not able to quickly adapt to the steep rise and fall of hormones in the second half of the menstrual cycle, it can really feel terrible. And the reason that the second half of the menstrual cycle is so special with respect to the need for resilience to hormonal changes is because the hormonal changes that happen in the second half of the cycle are 10 times in magnitude of those that happen in the first half of the cycle. So even though many, and you may have seen this too, have you ever seen the picture of the menstrual cycle that shows like the little bump in estrogen and how you see that in the first half of the cycle, and then the second half of the cycle, you get this comparably sized bump of progesterone. Those drawings aren't done to scale. And it's actually, if you look at the axes, the levels of estrogen are drawn to scale and the levels of progesterone are drawn at 10 times smaller than what actually happens. And if they actually drew it to scale, you'd see this itty bitty bump in estrogen in the first half of the cycle, and then this big, huge wave of progesterone rising and falling in the second half of the cycle. And this means that this is a time of enormous hormonal change for women. The second half of the menstrual cycle is much more hormonal than the first because you're getting that big, huge surge and fall of progesterone, but you also get a second rise and fall of estrogen. And these things together require the cells in your body from head to toe, including the cells in your brain, to be able to quickly adapt and adjust what they're doing in response to things rising and falling. Because as our hormones rise and fall, it causes changes in neurotransmission. It causes changes in, the ways that our cells are communicating with one another. And if your cells aren't able to quickly adapt to that, they can quickly feel like they're being flooded or starved of activity. And this makes people feel terrible.
A huge thank you to our sponsor, We Heart Nutrition. We Heart Nutrition is America's premier pro-life, family-owned supplement company. These supplements are made in their most bioavailable form for your body for easy absorption and digestion. When I remember to take my vitamins, I feel it. I feel less brain fog, especially when I take the magnesium supplement. And when I forget to take my vitamins, I feel it. And they have a new product over at We Heart Nutrition that I'm excited about. If you know somebody who is concerned about their bone density or their bone health, there's a specific product for your bone health. Go to weheartnutrition.com right now and take their 20-second survey to find out the best supplement package for you. That's weheartnutrition.com. Use the code Lila at checkout for a full 20% off your order. Did you know that your health insurance plan likely covers abortion, abortifacients, and other unethical services? Most people have no idea that they're footing the bill for procedures that go directly against their beliefs. While there are health sharing ministries, some families need and want standard insurance. That's why I'm so excited to share about Presidio Healthcare, the nation's first pro-life Christian health insurance company. That's right, Christian health insurance, the first pro-life option that is not a health sharing ministry. If you're in Texas, visit presidiocare.com. That's Presidio care.com to get your quote today. If you're in another state, you can join the wait list and check out Presidio's nationwide pro-life provider tool at prolifeproviders.com. Help bring life-affirming healthcare to the rest of the country. Go to presidiocare.com. So why would your cell, like what are, and you get into this obviously in the book, and I'm going to go through the 4 phases and specific recommendations for optimization of health so that you're preparing your body for each stage and like working with your body. But why is it that you are, that if your cells are not feeling ready to receive that intense flood of sex hormones in the phase before the menstrual phase, in the luteal phase, why would your cells not be prepared? What are you doing? You're not sleeping enough, eating enough. Like, what are some of the culprits that don't set you up for success before menstruation?
Right. I mean, the things that don't set you up for success are the usual suspects. I mean, it's really anything that's going to be leading to chronic inflammatory activity in the body. So we're talking about not getting enough sleep. So that's a big one.
I feel like, do you get enough sleep, guys? I mean, it's such an Americans just hate sleep.
I know. And it's like almost like a point of pride for people where they're like,
between work and social, work and entertainment and screens, it's like there's no time.
And it's something that we really need to be more serious about. And this is not only true. And I spend in the period brain, I also talk about ways to support ovulation, because the things that support resilience to hormonal changes also help support healthy ovulation, which of course is how we produce our sex hormones. And so, when we're talking about like sleep, for example, in addition to the fact that this is important just for increasing our resilience to hormonal changes, it's really important for ovulation. And like one of the things that people don't realize is rates of failure to ovulate. I mean, they're very high. It's incredibly common. When we do research, and this is just in a pristine sample of women at near peak fertility. So this is like women ages 22 to 26. So we're looking at women, in fertile points of their cycle in life. And they don't have endocrine disrupting, issues going on. So they don't have PCOS, no endometriosis. These are all women with regular, predictable menstrual cycles. When we conduct research on them and track their hormones and track ovulation, we regularly find a rate of failure to ovulate at about 30% in any given data collection.
That's so crazy.
Well, it's so common. It's so common to have anovulatory cycles. And most women, when they're having them, have no idea that they haven't ovulated because they still bleed.
So so the cycles might be regular 28 days, but they're just not ovulating. They don't even know it. They're still getting their period. They still go through all of these hormonal changes.
Well, they don't go through all the hormonal changes.
They feel like maybe it felt normal to them.
Right. Yes.
But it wasn't actually happening.
Yes, it didn't actually happen. And this happens regularly. And I've talked to my colleagues who do this research. They find it at the same rate. It's about 30%. In a given sample, that you find about 30% of them, you're not able to capture ovulation. The women are still getting their period as planned. They have no idea that they didn't ovulate.
Now, is that because of, is the cohort of women that 30%, are they usually women who are not sleeping, not eating well? Or is it just naturally that about 30% of the time you don't actually release an egg?
So that's a really great question. And my guess is that our sample is a little bit special. And I'm going to tell you what's special about it. They're college students. And college students are notorious for their terrible sleep habits and their intense, stress. And those two things in particular are really bad for resilience to hormonal changes. So again, experiencing those hormonal changes as being really unpleasant, but also really bad for ovulation. And, one thing in particular that I think many people do not realize is that our circadian rhythm, right, that 24-hour rhythm that we have, that plays an important role in regulating our ovulation and regulating our menstrual cycle. And the internal timekeeper in our brain that sets ovulation is dialed into what's going on with our circadian rhythms. And so when we're not sleeping and we're not doing things like getting, good morning sunlight, which helps to regulate our circadian rhythms and makes us awake in the morning and then sleepy at night, when we're not having those things activated on a regular 24-hour interval, it can be really disruptive to fertility and really disruptive to ovulation. And it's also disruptive to our resilience to hormonal changes.
So if you are, let's go with the sleep issue. Like, let's say you take a red-eye flight, or you're just up all night, or you're up really late and you're not sleeping. Your sleep is really of poor quality. It could also be a situation, actually, you have a child at home who's up a lot in the night too. So you're not getting those full sleep cycles, or you're just getting less sleep cycles. In that case, would it delay ovulation potentially? So you might still ovulate, but it's delayed, or you might just totally miss ovulation. What is the typical response of the female body to poor sleep?
Right. It depends, right? And so in some cases it's just delayed ovulation, and then in other cases it'll just be a skipped cycle.
So could your cycle then go longer, or you just ovulate later in the cycle, but the cycle may still be 28, 29, 30 days?
Well, so generally when it comes to a cycle, interestingly enough, the last half of the cycle, the luteal phase, is a lot less variable than the first half of the cycle, the follicular phase, if we're just dividing it into two halves. And so the luteal phase generally lasts on average about 12 to 13 days. And this is how long a corpus luteum lasts.
More consistent.
It's more consistent. And so when we get an exaggeratedly long or short cycle, most of that variability is often created in the follicular phase when your egg follicles are being stimulated and ovulation is getting ready, like is being prepared in the body. And so, for example, if you have a delayed, if you have a longer cycle, it means that your body probably was like, wait a minute, and it stopped, stimulating egg follicles.
Or it took longer. Because there was maybe more stress, a lack of sleep. So it's like, now's not a great time to ovulate because your body's not doing too hot. You're not feeling that great right now.
Right.
And you might not even ovulate and you don't even know it.
Right. No, exactly. And this is what's so interesting is that, the female body is so smart that it's like our brain will not tell our ovaries to fully mature egg follicles and ovulate if it begins to get a lot of cues that suggest that this is not a great time for pregnancy. And things like social support, stress, our circadian rhythms, inflammation, poor health, all of these things, and especially if they're all happening at once, or calorie restriction. These things.
What about intense exercise?
Intense exercise is fine as long as you're getting enough calories in.
Okay.
So for a long time, they thought that the reason that pro athletes weren't ovulating was because of the intense exercise. But it turns out that it's not the exercise per se. And that if the women are fueling their bodies enough and eating enough to offset the huge calorie expenditure, that you don't get failure to ovulate. And women can continue to maintain their fertility and maintain ovulation when they're professional athletes, which is an important point.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's like the female body is incredibly smart. And, and ovulation is not something that we can take for granted. It's something that we really do need to support. And I think that, a lot of times, and we see that infertility is on the rise and so many women are struggling with trying to conceive, and their doctors I don't think are having serious enough conversations about the two things that I think are oftentimes hidden that play a really important role in terms of promoting fertility are social support. And there's been experimental research where they find that if you even just in a laboratory setting exclude a woman and make her feel left out, if she doesn't have making her feel lonely, that it will disrupt ovulation.
That's so sad.
Well, it is sad.
But a lot of American women, I think, and I'm saying American, I'm sure women all over the world feel this too, but there's a loneliness, especially if there's other young kids in the household. I think that can be really tough for women, or maybe they just don't have a good social system where they're going to work, they come home to their husband, but then they're not really feeling a sense of camaraderie that they're interacting with on a daily basis.
Right. And I think that it's so important to prioritize making those connections and building that village. I think that it's something that we tend to put off on, we tend to marginalize the importance of social connection. And we do this with our long work hours and the expectations that, your children participate in 8 different activities. And so moms are driving their kids around everywhere, and then they never have the opportunity to actually convene with one another. I think that it really can be an issue. I mean, it can be an issue in terms of worsening PMS by eroding resilience to hormonal changes. But then it can also be, it can be something that can be harmful to fertility by, increasing the probability of failing to ovulate because of lack of feeling of social support and stress. And that's the other one. It's like those two things together are two of the like dark nights in infertility and failure to ovulate, and certainly also in lack of resilience to hormonal changes.
I wonder how much, because we spend so much time on the phone and so much time on social networking apps and things like that, and that sort of psychologically replaces community in some way for so many people, or it feels like community, like they're maybe messaging with people on a social app or texting, but it's not that lived in experience of community. You're not like physically with someone, there's no touch. There's no like eye to eye. And I wonder how that has affected. I mean, I don't know if there's a study that's been done on that. Someone should study that, right? How that's affected fertility.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question.
Like social media is social media killing your fertility?
Well, yeah,
or at least affecting it.
I wouldn't doubt that it would be, and I feel like it has to be, because we do know that people's face-to-face interactions has a very different physical and psychological cascade than what you get when you're just looking at a screen. And yes, and when you're just looking at a screen and you're getting this like little reward nugget of like, yay, like this feels good right now, it's not actually creating meaning. And our brain is able to tell the difference between those two things. It's like the difference between junk food and healthy food, right? And our brain knows when we're creating meaning and meaningful connection and not meaningful connection. And it does seem like many of the interactions that people have over screens are these less meaningful types of interactions. And now, is there a way that we can shift, even people's mindsets in ways that might support their resilience to hormonal changes and supports their fertility? There might be, right? So it could be, for example, that if we had people just doing a simple journaling exercise every day where they write down all of the, write down evidence that you are socially supported that you found from today. Like, what are 3 pieces of evidence that you have social support?
I saw my friend.
Yes,
I got
exactly.
A hug.
Yes. And
I chatted with, this other person. I mean, that would be an interesting study.
Yeah.
It's like do 2 groups, similar nutrition, similar sleep, similar stress externally.
Yes.
The only difference is screen time. And I'm curious if there would be an effect on fertility. Screen time and the quality and quantity of physical interaction with other people, with community.
No, 100%. I'm actually working with a fertility clinic, and we're doing a study right now where we're going to be looking at infertility rates, but also the quality of ovulation. And we're doing this by looking at progesterone levels in the second half of the cycle, because a really good ovulation has a nice, robust progesterone response in the second half of the cycle. And we're looking at how partners support and stress within the relationship, whether or not that predicts worse outcomes when it comes to fertility.
What does a really good ovulation look like versus a not so good? And then there's also just lack of ovulation.
Yeah. So there's lack of ovulation. Like, a good ovulation is one where you have sufficient levels of progesterone being released, and being released for a significantly long enough amount of time to allow for pregnancy. And I forget exactly what the clinical cutoff is for what the number is, but there is a threshold number that's used in clinics. That's essentially a level of progesterone that will support implantation of a pregnancy, and then maintaining that level of progesterone long enough to allow for the embryo. Then once it gets fully implanted, it will begin to release progesterone on its own. And so it's essentially, are you reaching that threshold, and is it lasting for at least that 12 to 14 days that we expect progesterone levels to maintain elevation in the second half of the cycle to support a successful implantation?
Because if the progesterone levels are not sufficient, you could be getting pregnant in terms of there's ovulation happening and there's sperm egg fusion happening. So there's an early little tiny embryo, but implantation doesn't happen because you're just not your body couldn't fully get there. And so we don't even know how often that happens. There's no real, I mean, there's probably a way to track it.
Yeah.
How would you track that actually? You'd have to go like take a blood test at a certain
I think that it is a blood test.
Because your HCG is going to be super low because you haven't had implantation yet.
Right. It is super low. And they've done estimates of this based on and I don't know exactly what the research looks like in terms of like what is it that they're actually benchmarking, but the rate at which that happens is exceedingly high compared to like when people actually know that they've had a miscarry. And the majority of pregnancies or successful sperm egg fusion, the majority of those events don't result in pregnancy, and they happen and then due to either just failure to implant or failure of the body to produce enough progesterone to allow full implantation.
How are those studies done to even determine that?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting.
Because I've heard statistics that it's 1/3 of pregnancies don't implant, 1/4. I think you might have just said it's actually a majority. I'm curious how we know that.
Right. I think that we know it, and I'm trying to remember like what the actual studies are that I've looked at that. But I think that's a really interesting question, because like how that, I'm assuming that it's, that they had like a sample where they were just measuring women over time, but I don't know exactly what they were measuring.
Like a blood test or something?
Like doing blood tests. I'm sure that it had something to do with blood tests, because there are blood tests that you can take that will detect very early pregnancy before most over-the-counter pregnancy tests are able to detect it. But yeah, like I said, this isn't because, of course I'm a psychologist and most of my area of expertise tends to go from the neck up. I don't have a good, I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting because when we're trying to tackle this really epidemic of infertility, there's so many places where things could go wrong. And I don't mean to not make it sound so dramatic. There's multiple places where things could go wrong. And each place, I think, deserves its study, its research. And I do think that's why what you're doing is so groundbreaking in actually doing the research you've done. There's not a lot out there. There's some, there are studies out there, but I think it deserves much more attention. Right. But in order to even give it attention, we need to know the playing field of where to even look. Yeah,
completely agreed. And I think that that the idea that something like infertility can, in some cases, be just as simple as managing stress and building social connections and making sure that women are helping to also ensure their, the integrity of their circadian rhythms. So getting morning sunlight to help set their internal clock and that sort of thing. I don't think enough people make money off that. And so I think that those types of solutions are probably always going to end up not being the things that are talked about the most loud.
That's a really good point and a sad one. But it's true. One of our good friends, my good friend's Dr. Lauren Rubal, and she's amazing. And she works in reproductive restorative medicine. Yes. And it's not like a big moneymaker, compared to a lot of other technologically driven fertility treatments like IVF. She's doing it working with the woman's body and understanding the cycles and nutrition and, understanding, sleep and exercise and all of these things that you don't like take pills for,
Yeah.
You're not using a lab for, maybe to do a blood test to kind of see what your levels are at, but that's kind of the extent.
Right. Yeah, no, for sure. And unfortunately, that is a major driver behind a lot of, the recommendations that are made about like ways to deal with infertility. And I know people in the restorative reproductive medicine space as well, and have heard the same thing from them.
Love that field. It's such an important field. I just think it needs so much more support. I would love to go through though, just for people's knowledge, just because I really feel like this is a primer for people. So the menstrual phase, the follicular phase, the ovulation phase, and the luteal phase, you've mentioned all of them. Can you walk us through and just give like, okay, these are the two things. And I know some of the things will be similar, like guys, again, it's not rocket science, like take care of yourselves,
Yeah.
But I think you had some really great, just concrete advice in the period brain. And so I'd love to go through, I know the cycle, you start with the menstrual phase, first day of bleed. If it's okay, I'm going to end with that. And we start with follicular phase where you're preparing for ovulation.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just say this. How should we do it? So people sometimes like to slice and dice the cycle in different ways. You can do it in the 4 talking about menstrual, follicular, ovulatory, luteal. I like to talk about it in terms of two halves because it's really two distinct things that your body is doing to prepare for reproduction. There's attraction and sex, and that's the first half. And the sex hormone that's dominant there is estrogen. And then you've got the luteal phase, which is the second half. And the primary sex hormone there is progesterone. And so talking about these two things in terms of which hormone is like driving the bus, I think is most useful. And it also prevents it from being so specific that people get totally overwhelmed.
Right, because you don't know exactly, well, when am I going from
like,
follicular to ovulation? And when exactly did I ovulate?
Right.
And I know there's certain tests that you can take to try to ascertain that. It's not impossible, but it is tricky and it does feel overwhelming.
It does feel overwhelming.
To know exactly what day am I on in my cycle?
Right, exactly.
I mean, you kind of know, but what phase is this day in, I think can feel overwhelming when there's 4 of them. I like that. So you break it down to 2?
I just do 2.
Okay.
And honestly, the when you do things that way, it's like almost everything, there's almost no benefit, I think, of slicing and dicing it further. Because it really is all about like what sex hormone is dominant during that time. Because as that sex hormone changes, it's flipping all these switches in the body, right? And so your body, when it's in an estrogenic state, which is that first 2 weeks of the cycle, it has a lot in common with itself during that time, regardless of whether estrogen is rising and falling. The same is true for progesterone in the second half of the cycle, is that there's a lot of commonality in what happens in that phase of the cycle.
It makes sense to me. I've always thought that the recommendations for luteal and for menstrual were very similar.
Yeah,
so they're kind of like the same. But so actually, here's a question for you. So let's just do before ovulation and after is really how you look at it.
Yeah.
It sounds like. So with the menstrual phase, do you consider it complete when bleeding stops? Or is there actually a lingering even after bleeding stops that you would consider the end of menstrual?
No. I mean, it's just whenever bleeding stops. And I mean, honestly, that doesn't even matter that much, so which is, again, like the first day of your cycle is the day that bleeding starts. Whether bleeding stops on day 3 or day 5 or somewhere in between or after or before doesn't really matter. During that time, estrogen is going to be slowly ticking up. And when estrogen finally reaches a critical threshold, that's when bleeding stops, because estrogen is part of what helps to stabilize the endometrium and prevent you from bleeding. And so whether that takes you 3 days or 5 days, it really doesn't make all that much of a difference. It's just about, estrogen is beginning to rise. And during this time, generally, while women are bleeding, some women feel pretty depleted. And I really think that is actually a side effect of not taking enough care of themselves in the luteal phase of the cycle, because the luteal phase of the cycle is a time when, your basal metabolic rate really does increase. And they've done these studies where they look at availability of fatty acids and amino acids in the blood, in your blood supply across different phases of the cycle. And what they find is that in the luteal phase, that you are absolutely depleting your amino acids and your fatty acids. And it is all of those resources are being shunted into building and differentiating the endometrial layer. And so it really can leave you depleted, especially if you're not eating enough during that time.
So that would be that's where you get post-menstrual cycle blues.
Yeah.
Where you're not even, the bleeding stopped, but you just still feel maybe estrogen's rising, but you're still feeling depleted, and it's because you probably are depleted, you're saying.
Right. Yes. And especially, yes. So I think that for women who aren't feeling their best when they're bleeding and, soon thereafter, that probably having a better experience there is going to start in the luteal phase. So they need to just be paying more attention to the luteal phase, because I can tell you that since, adjusting, and I don't do these, I don't turn my whole life upside down based on what's happening with my cycle, but I definitely know when I'm shifting from the first half of my cycle to the second half of my cycle, from estrogen to progesterone. And I make sure that I'm giving my body what it needs in the second half of the cycle, including allowing myself to eat more calories. And in particular, I tend to eat more protein during this time because of this research showing that your body is depleting amino acids at a really high level during this time. I try to replace those things while it's being used. And then I find that when I start my period, I actually feel great. Like for me, the energy increase that I get from no longer having progesterone relaxing my brain and making me feel more internal, just the lift of that hormone for me when I go into the menstrual phase, like when I'm having my period, I generally feel really good. And during this time, and then throughout the first 2 weeks of my cycle, I capitalize on the fact that I have more energy. This is a good time for me to go and spend more time with my friends. And it's okay if I overload my social calendar because I feel more extroverted during this time. And there's research that suggests that most women do, that they feel more outgoing. And so this is a time when I tend to load up my calendar with things and not feel worried about, am I going to be able to handle this? Because I know that I can. I work out harder. So I tend to do most of my heavy resistance training in the first half of the cycle when it's possible. Sometimes when I'm traveling and that sort of thing, it doesn't make it possible. And so I'm not very draconian about this.
Yeah, being draconian just makes you feel stressed, and that's not good for your cycle.
Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah, it's not, And so it's I will do and it feels better to me then. Lifting weights feels good to me in the first half of the cycle because I have the energy for it. And that you also get a little rise in testosterone along with estrogen that makes those types of activities feel more enjoyable for many women. And I'm one of those women who feels better doing those things at that time. And so this is a time when I really capitalize on the fact that I tend to have a lot of energy. I don't need as much sleep. I don't need as much recovery time. I can sleep less and have really good recovery scores. When I look at things like my heart rate variability and my respiration rate, and my lowest heart rate, because I track all of that, and which I recommend that people do. I think it's a smart thing to do.
What tool do you use for that?
I use the Aura Ring.
I've heard great things about it.
I love it. I love it.
Should be sponsored, Harris. Aura Ring.
Yeah,
should get
seriously.
one.
I totally, yes. Aura
Our nanny
Ring
has an Aura Ring.
Yeah, no, I love the Aura Ring. Yeah. And it's especially nice because it really also does a nice job at chunking up your cycle because you'll see very clearly when you have a temperature rise. It's very obvious when you're ovulating. And now when you're in the luteal phase. And for me, like I said, first half of the cycle, I really just try to capitalize on my energy levels and my lower recovery needs. As I move into the second half of the cycle, when progesterone is the primary hormone, this is a time when I eat more. I listen to my hunger. So when my body is telling me it needs more food, I feed it. And I also tend to take more rest time, meaning that I prioritize getting more sleep because my recovery is always worse. And the reason for that is that your resting metabolic rate is higher, your heart rate is higher, your respiration rate is higher. It's harder for your body to recover because it's working harder. And so that means that if you're going to, especially if you have a busy calendar, because most of us don't have control. I don't have full control over my calendar. And sometimes I have really long days in the luteal phase. And when that happens, then it just means I need to take more care to make sure that I have more recovery time. And I go to bed earlier. And I find that my body pays me back dividends when I do that. I feel so much better when I prioritize sleep and recovery in the second half of the cycle. And like I said, it definitely makes then the beginning part of my next cycle so much better because I don't have that experience that many women do where they feel terrible when they have their period. I feel great.
You mentioned protein in the second half of your cycle as really important because of all the amino acids that you need to add to because you're depleting that part of you need extra nutrition in that space. What are some foods that you recommend are uniquely good for the second half of your cycle? And are there any that are uniquely good for the first half?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. So this is one of those areas where it really does get into speculation and theory. And so I'm just going to say that right now. And there's been very little research that's actually looked at, do women experience fewer menstrual symptoms, for example, when they heavy load on protein in the luteal phase before? Nobody's tested that hypothesis, right? Instead, I just look at the science, look at the fact that amino acids are being depleted. And so I say to myself, why don't I replenish those? Right. And so, but nobody's actually tested whether or not this has the effect that I think it has. So I just want to have that as a caveat because being somebody who's in science, it's important for me to talk about. Yeah.
That's so crazy though. That study hasn't been done yet.
I know.
There's so many fascinating studies that could be done around this. And this is a universal experience for virtually every woman that has walked the earth.
I know. And so for women,
it's interesting stuff.
It's so interesting.
And it has implications for fertility, for health, for obviously, what we want to do with our lives, productivity, relationships. I mean, really everything.
Everything. Yes, completely everything. So things I really like. I mean, It depends. So I eat a very plant forward diet, but I also eat animal protein. I like eggs. I like fish. I like, a really nice grass fed steak. Like those things are great. If you want to just eat vegetable protein, that's cool too. You can do tofu. You can do black beans. I love black beans. And if you do something like black beans with quinoa, you're getting all of the essential amino acids.
This is for luteal, or you're just saying
this is during the luteal.
Okay.
I mean, these are things that have anything that has high levels of protein is going to have a lot of amino acids in it, because protein, and especially animal proteins have all essential amino acids that our bodies need to build cells. And that's essentially what's being depleted during the luteal phase of the cycle, when our body is building this endometrial layer and differentiating these cells. Is it's just like soaking up all of these amino acids for these building projects. And so during this time, I tend to eat more protein. And like my favorite sources of protein are, I really like salmon. I could eat it all day long.
Same.
I like
It's great.
It is great. Like grass-fed filet. I love a grass-fed filet. It's so expensive, but it's so good.
Good ranchers, guys.
Yeah, exactly.
They're the best. I don't know if you've ever had them, but they're one of our sponsors and they really are amazing. So,
amazing. I'll have to check that out. So do they ship?
It's delivered to your door. It's all American ranchers and farmers.
I love it.
They're great cuts of meat. And I mean, I'm not just being biased because they sponsored the show, but they really are better than what I usually find in the grocery store.
Amazing. So I'm going to have to try that. And then
they do salmon too, actually. They do salmon, they do pork. I don't usually eat their pork products, but I'm sure they're great. Right. But chicken and then steak.
Great. Yeah. So, I mean, and you can get all of the amino acids that you need either from, you can do animal protein, but for vegetarians and vegans, it's also totally possible to get as many amino acids as you need from that type of a diet. And I would just recommend things like tofu. Again, like if you do something like black beans, and especially if you do it with something like quinoa, it's going to help provide the array of amino acids that your body needs to be able to feel its best and then be able to recover as you move into the next phase of the cycle. And so the only real dietary thing that I do really is I allow myself to eat more in the second half of the cycle. Like I listen to my body, and I've been kind of that way most of my adult life, where I've been very in tune with like what my body is telling me that it needs, and trusting that, just because I do eat a healthy diet. And when you eat a healthy diet, you can you can get a sense of what your body actually needs. And so it's really that. And then, like I said, I do tend to add more protein during that time, but that also feels better to me, like, because that's like what I want during that time. And so, but like I said, there's a lot of different sources you can use.
Yeah. And I think also different people will have a different experience with nutrition, but generally speaking, I think one of the things that you reference multiple times, besides obviously protein, is the importance of avoiding processed foods, heavy sugar.
Yes.
I think that, processed sugars are just like cancerous anyways.
Yes.
I never feel good after I eat processed sugar, as much as I love my scone from Pete's Coffee or whatever I do, it just doesn't feel good. And there's a reason for that. It's your body's not really designed to process that easily.
Right.
And so that's not going to be great for really anywhere in your cycle, I'm going to guess.
No, it's not. I mean, and honestly, it does. And it's going to make all of your transitions as your hormones shift feel worse, because those things they are pro-inflammatory foods. And anytime that you're causing inflammatory activity in the body, that does erode at cellular plasticity, which erodes at your body's ability to quickly adapt to hormonal changes. And so, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, the benefits that we can get, and I talk about different steps that women can make depending on where they are in the process in terms of their relationship with health and their body. But like really starting to do things to promote your resilience to hormonal changes now will make it, for women who are considering having babies, it makes the postpartum transition easier. For women who are cycling, it makes cycling easier. So it makes the second half of the menstrual cycle not feel terrible. It feels like a very functional time. You can tell that you feel psychologically a little bit different and physically a little bit different, but it's not bad. It's just it's like, day and later that day instead of day and night. And it also will end up making the perimenopausal transition easier, because when you have resilience to hormonal changes, it means that when your body is experiencing wild swings in hormones, whether it's postpartum, in the second half of the menstrual cycle, or in the perimenopausal transition, that it's going to allow the cells in your body to be able to more quickly adapt and then sort of seamlessly move through these things in ways that many women are not able to, just because our environment is so toxic in a lot of ways in terms of trying to erode at our health.
What about, you mentioned salmon. What about omega-3s? When are they most important, would you say, in our cycles?
I mean, they're always important.
Okay.
You know, if you like, if
like anything, sleep, nutrition, you're like, just do it.
It's just like do it all the time. And I mean, honestly,
time.
it's like there's a way to be really complicated about this, and then there's a way to be really easy about this.
I think some people enjoy the complication. It's like, so what recipe should I have right before ovulation? What should I do? You know, right before menstruation, during menstruation.
Right. Yeah. And you know, and one thing I've noticed is like when I have my period, I definitely crave red meat. And I do think that when you're losing blood, that your body's probably like, hey, how about some iron? You know, how about that? So like if for a woman, you know, ladies, if you're out there and you like really want a specific recipe, just like make something with lots of iron in it when you have your period. Other than that, I mean, honestly, like taking omega-3s, that is something that helps to ease. That's another thing that research has actually there's really good research on this. Omega-3s and vitamin D are the two that, I mean, it's like just the evidence is everywhere that it decreases PMS. It also supports ovulation. And yeah, it eases our, you know, going through these hormonal transition periods. It eases that in a way where it doesn't feel so disruptive.
Yeah. And I think if you're taking a supplement, using one that you ensure it has the vitamin D, it has the omega-3s, is really important, that it's designed with that. And many of them are. I mean, another sponsor we love is We Heart Nutrition, and they have the most bioavailable approach to the supplement so that it can be easily absorbed into the body. And I think, you know, omega-3s, vitamin D is of course part of that. But I think a lot of women, they would prefer to maybe emphasize or focus on a certain kind of food in one part of the cycle versus another if they knew that it would help.
Right.
But it sounds like you're saying, listen to your body and generally speaking, just eat healthfully. Like, I mean, you've obviously guidelines in here, but in a way, the answer to these questions about how do we optimize for fertility and how do we, you know, optimize our cycles, it's a kind of a boring answer, in that it's sleep, nutrition, you know, at least some moderate exercise.
Yes.
You can't go wrong. Just avoid processed foods.
Yes. No, exactly. And all of these things, you know, it's like, and we all know it. So in that way, the answer is boring. It's like, okay, yawn, you know, we know this. Everybody knows it, but yet so few people do it. And so what I have found in my experience is that usually the issue isn't that people don't know what to do, is that they don't know how to do it. And so in the book, one of the things that I do is I offer really good starting places, because I think for a lot of women, especially, you know, women today, where they have so many obligations, they've got to take their kids here, they've got this job, they have this volunteer activity and this volunteer activity, and they're trying to have a relationship with their husband, and they're trying to have a relationship with their friend. And it's just, you know, it's just a lot. And it can feel like, okay, now you want me to also be cooking all these, you know, from scratch meals, and, you know, and getting morning sunlight, and
scone.
Yeah. It's
don't
like,
do it. And they're like, no.
And it becomes really hard. And so coming up with just some really simple first steps that you can take. And I also give some guidelines from what I've learned in my own life, because, you know, obviously, you know, I have a research lab. I'm a professor. I also am an author. I do public facing work. I am a wife. I am a mother. I am a friend. I am on the homeowners association board. I mean, you know, it's like I've got all of the same kinds of things pulling at me that everybody else does. And so I talk about some of the things that I've done that I find to be incredibly helpful in terms of just making sure that, for example, that I'm setting my circadian rhythm. So I have my coffee outside in the morning, so I get morning sunlight into my eyes, and it helps make sure that I'm sleepy at bedtime, and then I'm able to get a good night of sleep. And so that's, you know, a really simple step you can take that doesn't require you to totally turn your life upside down. Most people have their morning coffee anyway, and now you just take it outside, you put a hat on if it's cold, and bundle up. But I think that's really helpful. And other, you know, things, I talk about my routine, my weekly routine.
The meal prep.
Yeah, with the meal prep.
I think that's great.
I mean, it's like
chop the vegetables on Sunday.
Yep, Sunday afternoons. It is like, me in glass storage containers. I turn on my favorite music, my favorite podcast, listen to that when I'm doing things. You know, and when my kids were little, my husband would keep the kids, you know, doing things during that time, because it was my time. But it helped make sure that everybody was eating healthy all week, including me. And it really does make a difference, because we're all in a hurry, and anything that you can do to help stack the odds in your favor of making good choices for your body are really going to help. And they really do make a big difference.
changing direction just for a moment, going back to something you said towards the beginning that I wanted to pick up on, was about this woman's sex drive peaking before ovulation. She's preparing, she's more interested in sex. And a lot of women who listen to this show, we practice NFP.
Yes.
And so, and I think every woman should practice fertility awareness, which I think you advocate for too, understanding our cycles and working with our cycles and optimizing our health. But if they're delaying pregnancy or avoiding pregnancy, maybe they are having children very closely spaced together, or maybe there's a significant health issue and they don't want to do contraception of any kind.
Right.
And so they're going to avoid intercourse during sex during their fertile window, which is at 3 to 5 days, but they still want to be intimate with their spouse, their husband later in the cycle, but they're experiencing now the luteal phase, where maybe the sex drive isn't naturally as high. How can we optimize sex during that phase post ovulation, so that you can still enjoy physical intimacy with your spouse?
Yeah, no, really great question. And it's really interesting because, women's sex drive, you do get this peak in sexual desire periovulatorily, which, obviously if you're doing natural family planning is almost cruel. I mean, really, it's just terrible that you have this increase during this time. But the good news is that you can have a really beautiful and wonderful sex life in the luteal phase and in the non-conceptive phase of the
it's
cycle.
not cruel in the sense that, if it was actually cruel, it would mean women only enjoy sex 3 to 5 days a month, which is not true.
No, absolutely not.
And men, obviously, I think are primed to be able to enjoy sex daily. There's no fertility window for them. They're fertile if they're healthy every day. But I do think women can and should be able to enjoy sex their entire cycle. Oh, yeah. Not just this little tiny window in the middle.
No, I mean, look, the fact is that human females have sex across the cycle. And we're one of only a handful of species that actually do this. Most species, and especially when you look at like primates, they only have sex during what we call estrus, which is the fertile window. And outside of that, they don't have sex. Human females are very different, right? We have sex across the cycle. And there's other species that do that too, like prairie voles, for example, have sex across the cycle. And it's because sex serves more than just one function within a romantic relationship. There's the conceptive function, which obviously is something, where you're having sex during the fertile window. And then there's also sex for connection and maintaining the pair bond. And that's the reason that we have sex outside of the fertile window. And it serves this really important function. I mean, humans are characterized, when we look at us and just as like a species compared to other species, we're characterized by forming these long-term stable pair bonds. And this requires a lot of connection making within the relationship and the couple to be able to, do things to make sure that they're able to connect. And sex is a part of that picture. And because of this, human females don't experience no sexual desire in the second half of the cycle. We just tend to experience less what's known as spontaneous sexual desire in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And sex becomes more about connection. So I just want to unpack these things for you all. The first thing, this idea of spontaneous sexual desire. Spontaneous sexual desire is the type of sexual desire that occurs and appears out of nowhere, apropos of nothing, right? Like you're chopping your Sunday afternoon chopping vegetables, and you're just like, like sex sounds like a good idea right now. That's spontaneous sexual desire. Most women don't have a ton of spontaneous sexual desire.
So it's not even connected to attraction.
No.
It's not like you see your husband and you're like,
no,
so handsome.
We would even consider that responsive, what's known as responsive sexual desire, which is where you're having a sexual desire in response to some sort of
visual
cue.
Stimuli, or hearing the voice of your loved one or whatever, your husband. Okay.
Yeah. So spontaneous desire is just like, sex. And women have more, like when women do experience spontaneous desire, it almost always happens in the fertile window and when women's brains and bodies are primed for sex. But that being said, women, most of women's sexual desire is more of this, and now I just like
responsive.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is more responsive because
I think that's this idea that like men are always ready for sex, right? And then these are broad stereotypes. I don't love the stereotypes because I think they can cause a lot of confusion. But they can be useful in certain contexts. And so this idea that men are always ready for sex because of testosterone and they're always fertile, and women, in a sense, biologically separate from the relationship, may have this readiness for sex in the fertile window. But when you say responsiveness, we're talking more about not just a physical stimuli of like seeing someone visual, like you're attracted to someone, but more, I think, connected to the existence of our soul and our psychology. There's more of a connectiveness there. Like you desire someone because you want to be loved by them, you love them, you want to get closer to them.
Right. Yeah. And creating intimacy and connection. And that's what we find when you look at research and women's sexual behavior across the cycle. What we find is that women's luteal phase sexual behavior in particular is very much oriented toward intimacy and connection with their partner. And what this means is that, women can really build a really rich sex life in the second half of their cycle, particularly if it's going to be helping to meet those needs. So sex needs to be about connection and intimacy during these times to a greater extent than in the first half of the menstrual cycle, particularly in the fertile window, when women, the need for connection might not be quite the same, even with their own partner. And that's something I think that's really important to know, because if sex in the second half of the cycle really does seem to be motivated by a need to connect and create intimacy, then that means that these are the types of contexts that are going to be most supportive of sexual behavior in this time. Right. So what are things that we can do to help support building intimacy during this part of the relationship? And then these are also going to be the types of things that facilitate sex during this time and create, the opportunity for a really rich sex life in the second half of the cycle.
We had Adam Lane Smith on. I don't know if you've seen his work, but he's very much into attachment theory with couples, and also the impact of bonding hormones on sexual attraction and connection. And, one thing he talks about again and again is the importance of a woman's experience of emotional safety and connectivity to her SO, to her spouse or to her husband, to want to actually be with him. And then obviously there's an arousal curve that is going to be different in different parts of the cycle you're describing. And that intimacy piece is so key, where it's not like sex doesn't start in the bedroom. Sex actually starts in the relationship, like with the I love you in the morning.
Yes.
And feeling
absolutely.
supported by your partner and feeling safe with your husband and all of these other more emotional and psychological factors.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, sex for women in particular tends like foreplay starts like 2 days before sex or that morning. It's all about building intimacy and connection. And when women don't have that and those feelings of safety and security within their relationship, that does tend to be very bad for female sexual desire in particular. And so doing things to help create those experiences of intimacy between partners is incredibly important for female sexual desire and promoting a healthy sexual activity within a pair bond.
I think this goes back to the Period Brain book, because even if, let's say you have your partner, your husband's just so loving and he's always saying how beautiful, you're so sexy, you're so beautiful, and you're not feeling it, right? Those words might not be internalized as much.
Right.
But I think even just the self-knowledge of knowing our cycles, of understanding our own bodies, of understanding the importance of taking care of our bodies, that in and of itself is a confidence builder. And I think a lot of the lack of confidence around feeling sexy comes from just not enough self-care, like you just mentioned. We don't make space for it. And there's so many other things that are competing for our attention. But when you care for yourself, you are caring for your husband.
Yes.
You're caring for your children if you have children. You're caring for your future children if you haven't conceived yet, because you're optimizing yourself to be able to even have a baby. It's all connected. We don't live in little silos. Our health is helping other people. It will help other people be healthier.
Yes, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And for women, I think that we oftentimes get stuck into these traps of social comparison that can really ruin how women feel about themselves, where they're comparing themselves to, the people on social media or people, that they see in magazines. And I think that for women, especially if they're finding that they're struggling with their own inner feelings of sexiness, is to consider taking a little bit of a detox or a fast from social media and some of these other things. So that way they can start to build their own, work on how they're feeling about themselves. And then also, think about what are some of the things, think about the time that you felt the sexiest, like what was going on? What were the contexts? how can you replicate some of those feelings now, and sometimes it might just be a matter of a mindfulness shift. It might be going to get your nails done. It might be that, you need to change out of the Lululemons and that you need to have a date night, or that you need to even just go out and hang out with your friends.
And exercise, I think, is a huge boost.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And there's been so
even
much
going
research.
On a walk.
Yeah,
you just feel better. You feel more incarnate. It's like you're not so in your mind or even in your emotions over here. You're more like connected back to your body.
No,
just
absolutely.
by moving your body.
Yeah, moving your body. And it's going to help your body to be healthier. It's going to help your body look better. It definitely makes you feel more comfortable in your skin. I think that for women who don't exercise at all in particular, I think that they miss out on the feeling. It feels really good to have a body that does something other than get looked at. Like being able to go and walk, or being able to go and lift weights, or being able to do, yoga. When we're able to use our bodies and see them as a source of power, I also think that can really fuel our feelings of self-love and feelings of sexual desire that can really help to encourage those kinds of behaviors within our relationship.
I want to go to the birth control pill now.
Yes.
So we've laid a lot of foundation, which is great, but walk us through what the birth control pill actually does to a woman's cycle.
So hormonal birth control actually works by mimicking the hormonal effects of the second half of the menstrual cycle, right? So, when we talked about what happens across the menstrual cycle, you get the rise and fall of estrogen, and that's the first half of the cycle. Second half is the rise and fall of progesterone. The brain actually uses the presence of progesterone as a sign that ovulation has happened and that the body is waiting to see whether a fertilized egg will implant or not. And so what the birth control pill does is it gives you a daily dose of a synthetic version of progesterone called a progestin. And you take this daily dose of progestin, so it hits the progesterone receptors in the brain that make the brain believe that ovulation has just happened and that the body is waiting to see whether implantation occurs. And so taking that daily dose of hormone prevents the brain from stimulating the ovaries to ovulate. And that's how you get birth control, right? You're not ovulating, you're not going to become pregnant. But what it does do is, by stopping ovulation, is it prevents women's bodies from producing their own sex hormones. Because ovulation, in addition to being the thing that our bodies need to do in order to reproduce, is also the way that the female body produces most of its sex hormones. And so women who use hormonal birth control have very low and flat levels of what we call endogenous sex hormones, meaning the internal sex hormones that their own bodies produce. They're very low. And then instead, they're just getting these daily dose of synthetics. And the daily dose of synthetics usually has some low level of estrogen, so a synthetic estrogen that's kept at a really low level, and then a relatively higher level of the synthetic progesterone or progestin. And so in addition to the fact that it's kind of keeping women stuck in a state that's kind of roughly equivalent to the luteal phase, the progestins that are in hormonal birth control are also a little bit funky in that they do a bunch of things to the brain and the rest of the body that regular progesterone does not do. And this is because progestins that are in birth control are not synthesized from progesterone. Progestins are mostly made from testosterone, or they're made from a diuretic called spironolactone. And then their molecules are just manipulated in a way that allow them to get picked up by the progesterone receptors in the brain. But then they also sometimes get picked up by other receptors in the brain, including testosterone receptors and glucocorticoid or cortisol receptors. And what this means is that the cascade of events that happen psychologically and physically in response to the birth control pill really has no biological analog, right? No analog that happens in nature. Instead, it creates a creature, right, that is distinct from anything that would happen naturally. And so that is hormonal birth control in a nutshell.
And the creature that is distinct from anything that would happen naturally is millions of women who are on this pill.
Yes, yes.
So what? There's so many areas to unpack here. And so at the time we have left, I want to just go through some of them. Okay, let's talk about sexual attraction.
Yes. So here's what we need.
How does the birth control pill change the creature, the woman, in terms of how she's sexually attractive to people on and off? How is she different? Right.
And so to answer this, let's just return to our previous conversation about what happens when with women's sexual desire across the cycle. We know that all things related to sex and attraction are heightened when estrogen is high across the cycle, because this is when sex can lead to conception. This is when women feel sexiest. This is when women have their eye on men to the greatest extent. This is when women's sexual function is at the highest, and so on. Women on hormonal birth control aren't producing high levels of estrogen, and their estrogen is, so their estrogen production is being shut down. And they're getting, if any, because many forms of hormonal birth control, like the hormonal IUD, the hormonal arm implant, and the hormonal vaginal ring, they don't have any estrogen in them at all, or the shot, the birth control shot. And instead, these women have very low levels of estrogen, and then they're not being given any estrogen with the birth control. And then with something like the hormonal contraceptive pill, which is usually combined with both estrogen and progestin, these will have really low levels of estrogen. And so women who use hormonal birth control have lower levels of estrogen generally than women who are naturally cycling. And the result of this is it flatlines sexual desire, and it can potentially even lead to changes in mate attraction. And this research is based on, there's been like 25 plus years of research now linking rising levels of estrogen across a menstrual cycle with women placing a great emphasis on qualities related to masculinity in their male partners. So for example, when estrogen is rising across the cycle, women tend to have a heightened preference for masculinized male faces, voices, and behaviors, right? So women tend to really like testosterone and pick up on testosterone related cues when estrogen is high in the cycle compared to outside of that period of time. And it's hypothesized that they do this because, testosterone is believed to be what we call a good genes marker, meaning that only men who have good immune systems are able to produce high levels of testosterone, because testosterone is immunosuppressive. And therefore, if your body is not well put together and your immune system doesn't function well, it won't allow your body to release high levels of testosterone during development, because it would put your health being compromised. So research showing women have a heightened preference for testosterone markers when estrogen is high. What happens when women go on hormonal birth control and estrogen levels are kept really low? It seems there's been some studies now that have found that women who are using hormonal birth control exhibit a lesser preference for testosterone markers in male partners relative to what is observed in naturally cycling women, particularly near high fertility.
That's crazy.
Which is totally crazy. But
so just to break down like practically what that could look like, you find yourself attracted to, to put a stereotype words on it, but less manly men that you would maybe not find as attractive if you weren't on birth control. Maybe more feminine men, or
right. I think that more feminine, it like maybe puts too fine a point on it.
Okay.
Yeah. But I would say less masculinized for sure. And generally, and they've done studies where they look at the men who were chosen as partners by women who chose their partners when they were on the pill or off the pill. And they ran these, these facial composites on them. And then they had the facial composites evaluated for facial masculinity by an outside group of people. And then they also used a computer software that's able to look at things like facial width by height, which is correlated with levels of testosterone. And they did find that women who chose their partners when they're on the pill tended to prefer less masculinized male faces and chose partners with less masculinized male faces compared to the women who chose their partners when they were naturally cycling.
That's so crazy.
Which is crazy. You'd think, the idea of like your birth like having a medication and like side effects may include stroke, choosing the wrong partner, that it's a really provocative set of results. And it makes sense.
And I think more broadly, it's not so much individual. You may pick a different partner because just our immediate attractions to someone doesn't determine whether we choose to be with them for life or marry them, right? Although it definitely impacts it, but it doesn't determine. It's not like determinative. But that being said, I think more broadly, masculinity, I think in our country is often, or has been in the last few decades, looked down on, like displays of the more typical masculine, like, this idea of toxic masculinity. Now, of course, there's toxic masculinity. I believe there's toxic femininity. So you can make anything toxic, right?
Yeah.
You can break anything, but healthy masculinity that looks different from femininity. It's really the yin to the yang.
Yes.
I think, when if broad swaths of the population, women are on birth control pills and they're seeing that as not necessarily an attractive thing. It's not actually a thing that's a plus for these men. It's actually a negative.
Right.
You're shifting societally really the valuing of masculinity.
Right.
And actually what's more valued is a more feminine, potentially more feminine version of masculinity.
Right.
Look less threatening and more like me than look more different from me.
Right. Yeah. Which is really fascinating, right? Because we've definitely seen a cultural swing that has overlapped with broad use of hormonal birth control pills. And whether or not those things are related, that is an empirical question, as we say in the sciences, when somebody hasn't actually looked at that as a research question. But it's certainly possible, right? Because we do know that that research indicates that it does seem to de-emphasize the value that women place on cues related to masculinity. And when you have that happening and being repeated by millions of women around the world, devaluing cues related to masculinity, I mean, there's no reason to think that that wouldn't play a role in the larger cultural shift away from prioritizing cues related to masculinity.
I'm honestly also curious. I don't know if this research has been done yet, but if the birth control pill can also impact a woman's not just attraction to more masculine men, but attraction to men in general. Because I do think the rise of identification with LGBTQ, especially the Q, queer, like kind of like an open book, I'm bi, whatever. I wonder if there's any correlation or if any research has been done on women who take birth control pills and maybe a predominance of identifying as queer.
Right.
Because they have maybe more of they think they have a more sexual preference to the less masculine type.
Right. Yeah. And
just a theory. I don't know.
Yeah. So there's not any research on that, which, isn't surprising. It's a relatively small population, and small populations are hard to study. And we know that science doesn't always do hard things. And so this is a question that has not been asked. I do know of cases, these are individual cases where women have reported, and again, this is not scientifically, this is not tested scientifically. These are people who are readers of my book who've contacted me and say, I've got to tell you this crazy story about me. And I've heard it multiple times where women have had the experience where when they go on or off of hormonal birth control, that it has the effect of nudging them in and out of bisexuality, either from being, they're obligatorily, like they thought they were a lesbian and then they're on or off the pill and now they feel like they're bisexual. And then they go off it and then they're back to feeling like a lesbian, or they're heterosexual and then they're drifting, they're on or off of it and it makes them feel like they're bisexual, and then they go back on or off it and they feel like they're heterosexual.
I mean, it checks out with the other study. Like it could be a logical conclusion. Someone might identify more as a bisexual and more, they have attraction towards the feminine or what they believe to be more of the feminine women, not just men when they're on the birth control pill, just even based on the study. Again, this is conjecture, but sexual attraction is such an ambiguous thing too, and so personal. But
and sexual attraction lives on a continuum, and so and we know that hormones play a role, right? And so the idea that hormonal birth control, when you have something that lives in a continuum, we have people who are what we call obligatorily heterosexual, meaning that they really are only attracted to members of the opposite sex. Then you have people that we call like obligatory lesbians or gay men, and they're only attracted to other women or other men. These aren't the people who are having these experiences, right? It's the people who live a little bit more toward the middle, where they have, some maybe inclinations to be attracted to one or the other, and that the hormone changes initiated by the birth control pill or going off of it, right, nudges them just a little bit in the other direction. Because hormones, the way that they work is they have a nudging effect in the body. They kind of nudge you this way or nudge you that way. They don't generally cause you to catapult, from, being an obligatory heterosexual into an obligatory lesbian. That would never happen. But do I think that it's possible? That it nudges? Yeah, 100%. I think it's possible that it nudges, because we know that hormones play a role in sexual orientation, sexual attraction, and even gender identity. And so we know that hormones play a role in this. And so is it possible, and is it likely that for some small handful of people, that when they take these drugs that change their hormones, that it nudges them in and out of a category? Yeah, absolutely, that's possible.
So along with the change in sexual attraction or even experiences of sexual identity potentially, what else does the birth control pill do to women?
It can have, it can increase their risk of developing anxiety or depression. So there's been several studies now that find that women who use hormonal birth control are at a greater risk of developing major depressive disorder and anxiety disorder compared to women who are never users. And this risk seems to be asymmetrically shouldered by young women who use it. So adolescent women, and I'm characterizing an adolescent as somebody who's 19 and younger, those women, when they're on hormonal birth control, whether it's for acne or whatever the other reasons are that they might be on it, maybe pregnancy prevention, we know that these women are at a significantly greater risk of developing depression and anxiety relative to what we see of comparably aged women who are not using it. And this risk factor, it continues into adulthood. So adult women do seem to continue to have an increased risk of depression and anxiety relative to never users, but it's mitigated. So it decreases over time, and the teenage population is particularly vulnerable to it. And there's new research that indicates that women who take hormonal birth control in their teenage years may continue to have a lasting heightened risk of developing major depressive disorder that goes on throughout their lifetime, even after they discontinue using hormonal birth control. And this is something that almost nobody is looking at research-wise. There have been very few people who've even bothered to ask the question of what happens to women when you shut down their hormone production and give them a synthetic when they're in the pubertal transition and their brain is still finishing developing. Very few people have asked, like, why are we doing this? Like, is this a really smart idea?
Why is that? Why?
I think that...
I mean, I have a little window into it because I spoke out about birth control like 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And people out of the woodwork were condemning me. And I was just talking about the risks of birth control. Certainly there's a moral case to be made, but it's like you're dispelling, you're creating fear around this like life transformative drug. Like it was, I think just this fear of the information might make women not want to take it anymore.
Right.
It's
yeah.
like, since when is information a bad thing?
Right. No, I completely agree. It's like information is always a good thing, and then let women decide for themselves what they want to do. And with teenagers, I mean, this is a very vulnerable population. Their brains are still developing. And this, when your brain is developing, this is a time when things that you do can have a lasting impact. And the fact that we're using generations of women as research participants in an experiment that they didn't even know that they were part of is really scary, and it's really sad. And there's no way that giving a developing teenage brain hormonal birth control isn't going to change brain development. It was like literally a miracle would have to happen for it not to affect brain development. We just don't know in what ways and to what degree it matters. And this is what we really need research on, because girls are being put on this for issues as minor as acne and having irregular menstrual cycles. And the fact is, like, most women and most girls, I don't think would make the decision to go on something for acne or for irregular menstrual cycles that could have the effect of putting them at a long-term risk of major depressive disorder. But this isn't being communicated to them. And this, I think, is really tragic, because I don't know how many people have had the experience that I've talked to who were put on hormonal birth control as teenagers, didn't have the information, and now they're an adult with mental health issues, and there's really nothing that they can do about that now.
That's so wild.
And it's sad.
It's so sad. Again, this is completely a theory, or more of a question than even a theory, but I do think there is this is social data coming out, unprecedented cohort of women, a growing number of women who don't want motherhood. Mm-hmm. And you could blame modern stressors, because it is a very stressful day and age in many ways to be a mother. It's also in some ways, you could argue, the safest time in human history to be a mother. So you can kind of play it both ways, but there is, objectively speaking, a growing number of women who say they don't want to be mothers, more than historically that we have been able to survey. And that, I wonder if that's connected to the this huge use of the birth control pill, if that somehow just hormonally shuts down what the natural cycle is, and then maybe the natural rhythms of the body that would even want, make you psychologically want or feel a need to mother or be a mother. Right.
Yeah. So I've got two answers to that. So the first one is that, I would be very surprised if it played no role, right? Like, it's got to play some role. And I say this just simply because I have a friend who does ovulation research and does, looks at hormones as they shift across the cycle. and women's desire for babies and that sort of thing. And she finds that it has a hormonal rhythm.
Meaning you have a desire for babies when you're ovulating.
Like right near ovulation when
Makes
hormone
sense.
levels are, when hormone levels
There's
are
more of
high.
a natural desire. Yeah.
Yes. And so, so we know that there's some relationship between cycling sex hormones
So if you
desire.
sorry to interrupt, but just to be clear, so if you're never ovulating, if you're shutting that down via the birth control pill, that potential period of time where you're more naturally disposed to want to have a child is going to just not happen for you.
Right. That can get, that can be, we'll just say blunted, right? That can get blunted, meaning that women might just not really have that inclination, that impulse, that feeling that they really want to have children, right? Because they're not getting that little bump from estrogen. And so I think that probably is part of it. And I've also heard from women, and it's so funny, people tell me their stories, of course, because, I wrote this book. And so people will email me. And I've had a number of women also email me and tell me that they never thought they wanted to have children. And then when they started cycling again, all of a sudden their biological clock just came roaring back onto the scene. And they were like, oh my gosh, like, I'm like, who is this person? Like here I am thinking that I'm, like have everything figured out and that I don't need to have kids and that I don't need this. And then all of a sudden, I go off the pill and here it all is. It's like, okay, I'm like this, walking stereotypical woman. And I'm like, yeah, stereotypes are a thing for a reason. There's usually a little
I'm ready for a baby now. I'm finally ovulating after 15 years.
Yeah, exactly.
It's wild.
It is wild. So that's like one answer to the question. Another answer to the question that I think is really interesting is just this idea that for most of human history, like you didn't need to want to have kids. If you liked sex and you were in a long-term relationship, you were having kids. Doesn't matter whether you wanted them or not.
The optionality wasn't just
there was no
there
optionality. It was just like you were going to be a mother, like it or not. And because even if you were really good at like let's say like Stone Age natural family planning, chances are at some point you're going to end up with a baby, at least one. And people who there was never any direct evolutionary pressure on the desire to want children because there was no alternative, right? But now we are in an environment where there is going to be, there's direct evolutionary pressure on the desire to have children. Because
and even to marry, because it's like, why would you pair bond?
Right.
Why do we don't need men the way we may have needed men 100 years ago. So I think there's also that part of it too.
Yeah. But the reproduction one is so much more closer to the evolutionary engine because it's about passing down genes. And so it's like, we have these generations of women right now who don't want to have children. And if they don't have children, that's going to like select against genes related to not wanting to have kids. And so 200 years from now, or a couple generations from now, I'm expecting that we'll see that most women, because it's going to put direct selection pressure on the desire to actually have children. That was never something that needed to be selected for in the past.
Meaning you're saying there might be a genetic connection between women who are more predisposed to wanting children potentially, and therefore they would naturally pass that on, and other women who don't have it wouldn't.
Yes, exactly. Yes, there is a genetic. There's a genetic
you could say that about the gay
to almost
gene
everything. There is no, but there's like no such thing as like a gay
there
gene,
isn't,
and there's
but
no
the theories around it. Like, well, if sexuality is innate, if homosexuality is innate,
right? Well, there's genetic tendencies, right? So like there's a genetic contribution to being gay, right? There is a genetic contribution to wanting or not wanting children. There's a genetic contribution to just about anything. And it's not to say there's an isolated gene that specifically does this one thing, because genes just don't work that way. They're a big mess of spaghetti, and the genes that are related to our tendency to want children, not want children, may also be related to things like bone density and toenail width. It's like our genes are messy and we just don't know. But, if women who don't want children are not having children, the genes that are related to the desire not to have children ultimately are going to decrease over time, just because they're not getting inherited. And so, 200 years from now, we might find that we all want kids.
We'll see. And we'll be like, no more birth control pills either.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
I want to ask you about obesity too, because that's also in the last, and I know nutrition's huge part of this. It's like the junk, literal crap we're eating is a huge part of this. I'm curious if you think the obesity crisis has anything to do with the rise in the use of birth control.
Okay, interesting. So walk me through that.
Meaning cravings, the food that we're consuming or we want to consume, the way we may retain weight, our metabolism. How does that interact, if at all, in your view, with the birth control pill?
I don't.
Because weight gain is on the insert. I mean,
Right.
it is actually
Yeah.
like the birth control pill tells you
Right,
in its
that-
own insert that weight gain could be a side effect.
Right. And a lot of times the weight gain that you get with birth control is related to changes in water weight from the artificial hormones in them. But I mean, I think that being overweight and obese is definitely related to hormonal imbalances, which we can talk about briefly. I don't know that I see a relationship with it and the birth control pill. But to speak about hormonal imbalances, one of the things that you and I talked about very early on in our conversation was about, infertility and how rates of infertility are rising so rapidly. One of the things that fertility is harmed by in huge ways for both women and men is overweight and obesity, because fat it acts as an endocrine organ, and it is estrogenic, and it converts testosterone into estrogen via an enzyme called aromatase. And what happens when you have an overweight man is his body is aromatizing his testosterone into estrogen, which is also why you get breast development in overweight men. It's part of these estrogens that get released when you're aromatizing testosterone. That lowers testosterone, which lowers sperm counts, and that hurts male fertility. For women, you can get disruption in ovulation via changes in insulin levels, which can lead to PCOS, which is one of the leading causes of infertility. It also is estrogenic in women, but not in a way that feels like a fun estrogenic party, like you feel in the early phase of the cycle when your sexual desire is high and you feel attractive. Instead, when estrogen levels are very high and unbalancedly high, this leads women to experience breast tenderness. It also can lead to infertility, and it can lead to via endometriosis, because endometriosis and overgrowth of the endometrial layer is oftentimes fueled by excess estrogens in the environment. And so obesity and overweight are really, drivers not only of lack of resilience to hormonal changes. So women who have these, body types or these phenotypes, they're going to be more likely to get bad PMS, but they're also going to be more likely to suffer from infertility. And if their partners are overweight and obese, they're going to get a double whammy on their fertility, because it's also going to be harming male fertility.
And then last question, cognition. Just, mental sharpness.
Yes.
Women on the birth control pill versus getting off of it and, optimizing your health during your cycle. Are there impacts? Yeah.
So we know that estrogen is really excitatory in the brain. It causes the, different neurons in the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory in the brain. It causes it to sprout new dendritic spines, making your brain more sensitive and more able to take in information and be able to learn it and then apply it for later use. And because women who are using hormonal birth control, again, estrogen levels are kept really low and constant, you're not going to get that nice little boost of cognition and
brilliance.
memory. Yeah, these boosts of brilliance that you can get as a naturally cycling woman, right? And one more thing that we didn't have a chance to talk about that I'll just mention briefly is that we also find that women who are using hormonal birth control also oftentimes exhibit a compromised ability to regulate their stress response. And that women who use hormonal birth control exhibit a stress response that looks very similar to somebody who has PTSD or who's experienced chronic trauma, because both hormonal birth control users and trauma survivors have a blunted cortisol response to stress that is the result of their body turning off the stress response. And the reason that the body turns off the stress response is if cortisol receptors are being absolutely overwhelmed with stress hormone signaling. And in the case of somebody who suffered trauma and PTSD, that's obviously the source of their over cortisol response. But in hormonal birth control, it's believed to be the progestins that are in hormonal birth control, because again, they don't perfectly match onto just progesterone receptors in the brain. They also are latching onto cortisol receptors. And so this is believed to send the body into a state of hypercortisolemia, which ultimately turns the stress response off in the body because it's being overwhelmed by stress signaling. And that potentially can compromise not only women's mood, potentially being a contributor to the greater risk of depression that we see in women who are on hormonal birth control, but can also lead to a diminished ability to regulate their responses to stress, right? These things are not positive, and these things need to be clearly communicated with women who want to go on hormonal birth control. So that way, if they choose to be on it, they feel like they're making the decision with their eyes wide open, knowing what side effects to look out for. So that way they can decide whether or not the trade-offs make sense for them. And if they do make sense for them, knowing what to look out for.
I mean, separate from the questions of barrier method contraceptives, just if you look at, okay, what are the disadvantages of delaying sex during the fertile period versus a birth control pill? And obviously there's the fail-proof note you made of like, well, you might get your window wrong, right?
Right.
But separate from like maybe not getting it perfect, right? Every time. It's like you're trading, your heightened moments of feeling sexually arousable, right? But you're not getting that on the pill anyways.
No, you're not. No, and
you're not.
Fact,
you're missing that whole experience anyways. You just have your flatline.
Yeah, like one of the
like give me the no pill experience then. Like I'm not losing it. Like what am I losing? I know you've got to go. The last question that I'm sorry I didn't ask yet, but it's also so important because you talked about it a lot already, is infertility. Does the pill impact fertility?
So the answer to that is no. So the research shows that for women who use hormonal birth control, that generally you get a cycling that resumes within a month and a half, is on average a month and a half, you're ovulating again. So I will say, so the answer is no, but I will also say this, that sometimes hormonal birth control can indirectly be related to infertility because it either masks issues that harm women's fertility. So things like PCOS and endometriosis. You'll have women who are given the pill as a way to minimize their symptoms of these conditions when they were teenagers, not really realizing exactly what that meant. Then they go off it when they're 35 and they want to have a baby. And all of a sudden these symptoms start roaring back on the scene that are compromising their fertility. And they had no idea that they were then going to have to deal with this issue in order to get pregnant. So that's one thing that can happen.
So they lived with this issue chronically without even
knowing it.
And that could damage
and that
fertility.
Damages fertility, right? And so that can then, they can lose a year of time, before they're even able to start trying to get pregnant because they first have to figure out what to do about the endometriosis or how to manage the PCOS. And so that can cause issues for women trying to have babies. The other issue is that for many women, it will also lead them to again, choose not to have babies until they're 35. And then they go off the birth control pill and then realize that, oh no, my fertility is already decreasing and I'm no longer able to get pregnant. And so even though the pill itself does not cause any changes that impair fertility, it can cause women to delay pregnancy into a time that it does become difficult just simply because women's fertility does decrease over age. And it can mask the symptoms of fertility impairing issues that need to be dealt with prior to pregnancy.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
All right, Dr. Hill, how can people find your work?
They can find The Period Brain and This Is Your Brain on Birth Control anywhere that books are sold. So you can order it online. You can go to your favorite bookstore. You can find me online at sarahehill.com, and that's Sarah with an H. And you can find me on all social platforms, and my handle is Sarah E. Hill, PhD, and I'm most active on Instagram.
Thank you for your work. I think it's brave.
Thank you.
I think by you being brave, more people can be brave and just speak the facts on these things. But I really appreciate you and you taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode with Dr. Sarah Hill. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Please share this episode with a friend. That helps the podcast grow. I think this information is so important for every woman and man to be aware of. Also, make sure that you are subscribed. Please hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening over on podcast app, make sure that you are subscribed over there. Leave us 5 stars and a review. That also helps the show grow. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. A huge thank you to our partner, EWTN, the largest religious broadcaster in the entire world. EWTN is reaching millions of people every single day with the beautiful truth of the gospel. You can watch new episodes of The Lila Rose Show 24 hours before they hit podcast app over at EWTN.com/on-demand.